Good afternoon. Welcome. My name's Dr. Stephanie Barrientos. I'm from the Institute of Development Policy Management and Brooks World Poverty Institute at the University of Manchester. And I just want to welcome everybody first to this provocation, very important, on making markets work, particularly for smallholders or wage labour. Before we start on the main programme for the afternoon, I want to pass over to Dr. Bill Vorley from the IIED, who's going to give a broader overview of the series of which this provocation is a part. But I just wanted to start by welcoming you all.
Good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome from me to you in person and over the live stream. My name is Bill Vorley, as Stephanie said. I'm from the International Institute for Environment and Development. Small-scale agriculture is well and truly back in the spotlight, and small-scale agriculture is seen as a key to future food security, to provide supplies for the food industry, for rural poverty reduction, for political stability, for the conservation of natural resources, and for adaptation to climate change. There is now quite a broad consensus around the importance of small-scale agriculture. But beyond that consensus, on the way forward, the debate is highly contested and quite polarized. Excuse me. Do we emphasize markets or do we emphasize rights as core pillars of smallholder development and policy? Is large-scale agribusiness a partner in smallholder development or a driver of exclusion? And for today's debate, do we need to rethink our emphasis on smallholders and have another look at wage labour and large-scale plantation and estate agriculture as drivers of rural economic development and as livelihoods of the poorest of the poor? So as part of the knowledge programme, it's a Hivos inspired knowledge programme. Hivos are represented here by John Van Doorsum, over here. And the knowledge programme is exactly on smallholder agency in the globalised market. We are seeking to provoke debate on these issues, these stock parts of the debate, and these dilemmas, rather than leave the debate unchallenged. This knowledge programme is a collaboration between Hivos, IIED, and Mainumbi, which is a Bolivia-based research and policy organisation, and a global learning network that comprises business people, farmer leaders, civil society organisations and researchers in Latin America, East Africa, and South and Southeast Asia. Much of the work of the learning network is done in those countries. But this series of provocations are set up in Europe, specifically to be up close to the development community of donors, of researchers, of business people, of investors, who also have a big stake in this debate. And we're doing it in the noble city of Manchester rather than the usual centre of gravity, which is London. This is an important centre of excellence on development and on agriculture and associated research. So this is the fourth in the series of provocations. Each one has been led by partner organisations, in this case IDPM at the University of Manchester, which Stephanie will introduce in a minute. We've had ones in The Hague, in the Netherlands, in Stockholm, in Sweden, Paris, and this is the fourth in Manchester. And the next one on June 22nd will be in Brussels at the European Parliament on inclusive business and producer empowerment. So that should be a nice, rich compost and food for thought there for a good provocative debate. So just a couple of key points on our ways of working. Our panelists are here to start debate and not to dominate debate. Everyone here is a debater. You are not an audience. And that includes the people connected to us on the live stream. And the people connected to us in English and in French on the live stream are invited to make interventions over email in English and Spanish, and we want to have their interventions introduced into this debate as we go. So again, a warm welcome from me. That was my introduction to this series of provocations, and you won't be hearing from me, hopefully, until we close at 4:30. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. I just wanted to give just a brief introduction to this afternoon's session. Firstly, I should say just a little bit, we really welcome everybody at Manchester University, both those who are able to be here in person, but also very importantly, for those who are joining us by live stream. And as Bill said, there will be a number of people hopefully participating in the discussion and the debate, as well as hearing us through live stream. So this is an international event, and I think it's very timely that it should be held at Manchester for a number of reasons. We have a long history of development research and development policy at Manchester. In particular, we've done a lot of work over the years on issues around agrarian change, agriculture. There are many people in the room who at different times have participated in that development of that work at Manchester. We currently have a very strong group of researchers who are working on issues around global production networks and wage labour. So for me personally, as I'm part of that group, it's very good to see that we're having a debate around wage labour in agriculture. And before I just say a few more words, I should mention that this event is being partly supported by one of the research programs which is capturing the gains, which is, you all have a leaflet if you're here in your packs, and that's co-supporting this event, and that's also involved in research in trying to look at economic and social upgrading for workers and small producers, including in the agro-food sector. Now, one of the key challenges for me, as somebody who's worked for 10, 15 years on issues of agricultural exports especially, but also changing agricultural markets, is that so often the wage labour issue is overlooked. And yet, labour is such a critical part of agricultural production, both through unpaid family labour and or through casual labour, and or increasingly as you're getting the sort of advance of agro-food chains through the production of more high-value agricultural goods. So I think it's really important that it's brought in as part of the discussion, and that we better understand the relationships between wage labour and workers and smallholders, small producers and farmers. But also I think it's even more critical in a period of very rapid agrarian change, which is going on at a global level in terms of rising commodity prices, climate change, and general pressure in terms of demand, new forces of demand for agricultural commodities. So without much further ado, I'm going to just say a few practical issues which I want to, particularly for those of you who are physically here, which is that if there is any emergency, the fire exit, the nearest one, if you go out of the door, you turn right, and the fire exit is just down there, and the conveniences are located in approximately the same place. For those of you on live stream, you'll have to look for your own fire exit. And I think, unless there's anything else, Bill, that you think I've overlooked, should we proceed with the panel? Okay, so I'm going to chair. We've got two sessions, two panels. We're going to have quite a short break in between the two, which is really a comfort break, because we're very aware of our many colleagues internationally who are with us, and we don't want to leave them just hanging for too long. So the first panel was a group of 3 speakers, and the focus of this is slightly more to get the context. What is actually changing in relation to smallholders and wage labour, and why are there shifts taking place? What forms do they take? And very importantly, from my own personal perspective, and I think a critical aspect, what are the gender dimensions? So we have 3 speakers, panelists, who are going to each speak for around 12 minutes. 12 to 15 minutes. Then once we've had the 3 speakers, we're then going to open it up for discussion. And this is discussion of those both in the room and joining through live stream. And this is a debate, it's a provocation, so please be provocative. Raise issues even if you don't agree with the issue, but you feel it should be raised, because we've really got to air all the different perspectives and the different views. And then we'll have a short break, and then we'll go to the second panel. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Sally Baden, who is from Oxfam. The second speaker will be Meet Martins, who's from the University of Leuven, and then finally Sukhpal Singh, who's from the Indian Institute of Management, the Centre of Agriculture. Centre, yeah. So I think we'll start with Sally, and we'll just go through the speakers, panelists first, hear their perspectives, and then we'll move on for the wider debate. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie and Bill, for that introduction. So I'm going to talk for hopefully 12 minutes about why we are seeing shifts from smallholder farming to wage labour in agro markets, and particularly about the gender dimensions of those shifts. When I read this question, my first thought was, well, are there shifts? I suppose I wanted to unpick it a bit. And are the shifts from smallholder farming to wage labour? So thinking about that, definitely, of course, there are dynamic processes going on of shifts in rural livelihoods and rural livelihoods diversification. But I think it's important not to see it as too much of a dichotomy between smallholder farming on the one hand and wage labour on the other, in the sense that the broader context is about patterns of rural livelihoods diversification at a sort of global level, where not only are more and more people engaged in agriculture, who have historically been engaged in agriculture, doing more off-farm agricultural work, but they're also increasingly doing non-agricultural work. And so I think it's kind of very important not to see this only as about agriculture, but to see it in the broader context of the ways in which poor rural people are diversifying their whole livelihoods. I mean, in that sense, you know, that there is a persistent and pretty universal pattern of shift out of agriculture going on across developing regions, although obviously the extent of that is varied, so that what we, you know, if you look at recent data, what you find is that more than 50% of rural people's livelihoods actually coming from off-farm sources, and slightly less than half of it from non-agricultural sources. So there is that big shift taking place. The one sort of qualification to that shift is that in sub-Saharan Africa, it's not happening nearly as fast compared to the other regions, but also that across the board, pretty much, women's share of the agricultural labour force is at a slow pace increasing. So there's some sort of indication that there is a kind of feminization of the agricultural labour force going on. Now that includes every aspect of the labour force, but it also probably doesn't include a lot of the work that rural women do. Because if you start to interrogate the figures, you know, the latest data from FAO and others about rural men's and women's use of their time and the aggregate figures, what you actually find is that there's a huge unaccounted for portion, particularly in the female economically active population, that's either unreported or non-active. And so there may be a lot more work of rural women going on that we're not actually even recording. So the point is, it's not a dichotomy that there's this bigger picture of rural livelihoods diversification, and also that a lot of the wage labour that's going on is going on within smallholder households. And Stephanie alluded to that in her introduction. It's going on as unpaid family labour, it's going on as casual wage labour, and so on. And so it's very important that we don't kind of separate the two out. And as Oxfam, what we've been starting to think about a lot recently, because we have tended to focus on work on smallholder agriculture in agro markets, is looking much more at, within that, what's happening in terms of labour relations and how's that linking into labour markets and hiring of labour both, or use of labour both within the household and outside. So, for example, in a programme that we evaluated recently in Honduras, of the smallholders' income in that programme, about 40% of it was actually coming from wage labour. So very, very important that we're understanding that these are combined livelihood strategies. I've mentioned that the extent of this shift varies sort of geographically, and I've also kind of qualified it in terms of the fact that that the agricultural labour force appears to be becoming feminized. An exception to this is Latin America, where because of levels of education, men are more concentrated, higher relative levels of education of women and urbanization, men are still more concentrated in agriculture. But then when you look at agricultural wage labour, or at least the data I've been looking at over the last few days, which, you know, as I'm sure we all understand, is fairly patchy, it's not clear that, that there's a feminization of agricultural wage labour. Of course, this may be due to underreporting of that, and that could be linked to sort of perceptions in the sense of how do women and men both perceive what women do, and a consistent kind of undervaluing of the work that women do or non-recognition of it. But the only region where there appears to be a greater proportion of women than men in wage work is South Asia. And so again, there's a lot of differences here. It's not a universal pattern. What are the reasons for this shift? I think there are many issues we could look at, but one issue is that for at least some smallholder farmers, the viability and the riskiness of smallholder farming the viability is decreasing of smallholder farming and the riskiness is increasing. But I think, again, we can't lump all smallholders together, and there are different groups of smallholders and probably a sense of differentiation going on within that sector. And within that differentiation, I think what we can probably hypothesize is that those who are staying in the more sort of residual subsistence, what some kind of times called hanging in agriculture, that's probably the bit that's becoming more feminized. And I think we see patchy evidence of that in some countries, like China, for example, where it's kind of older women who have got left behind in agriculture. A number of reasons why there's that decreasing viability or riskiness for some, which are to do with the scale of land holdings, which are already smaller for women, even where they can have access to land, market liberalisation, increasing costs of inputs, and of course climatic variation and its impacts, as well as other long-term environmental processes, soil fertility, and so on. I mean, the other issue, which others will probably talk more about, is the globalisation of agro-food chains and how that has led to the development of some specific sectors which have in fact become very feminized. And I think Meet will talk more about that. But I'm wondering if we're not sort of overplaying the significance of that. It is important. It's important to us because we're based in the countries that are sort of linked into those value chains. But as a sort of proportion of the total volume of agricultural wage labour out there, and where the totality of women are in that, I think we should be giving equal attention to the wage labour that's happening in less organised agricultural sectors, even if we know that there's a trend towards that organisation. Checking the time. So to the extent that there is this shift, do we think it's beneficial to women or not? And I suppose I'm kind of already indicating some of what I think, but I really want to kind of qualify this in the sense that, people arguing on the one hand that getting into wage labour markets is going to lead to women's economic empowerment, or women becoming sort of these empowered, managers of agro enterprises. I mean, a problem for me with that is that it's sort of only looking at one piece of the pie. It's only looking at, how women integrate into the market, and there's this whole sort of shadow behind that of all the kind of socio-cultural norms and beliefs, and also gender norms and relations that are not operating within the market sphere, but which are impacting on how women can engage with markets. And I think we're tending to get into a discourse about women's economic empowerment which is too narrow, and not looking at it holistically, so that simply having women inserted in markets in more direct ways, and yes, getting control over the cash income, and yes, that does impact on how visible they are and how mobile they are and what they can say in the household, but it doesn't necessarily change the distribution of labour within the household. It may mean that they're working much longer hours. It may mean that those sort of gender inequities within the labour market are persisting and being played out in different and new ways. I think as Oxfam, to sort of try to conclude, would argue that there are gender issues linked to the growth of wage labour in agriculture, both in large-scale and small-scale farming, which need to be addressed. I mean, I agree with Stephanie's initial proposition that as development agencies, and this is certainly true of Oxfam, we have tended to focus not enough on the wage labour dimensions of what's happening in agriculture, and that issue is increasingly staring us in the face. But I think it is staring us in the face as a very gendered issue, in the sense that there is gender discrimination in those labour markets, that very vulnerable types of women tend to be pushed into casual wage labour in agriculture, not necessarily in your organised sectors, but in other kinds of sectors, because it's their only option when they have insecure assets. And there are also issues about how do we address that? What are the ways of organising? What are the ways of reaching those people who, aren't in farmer cooperatives? Or so I had an experience, just a couple of little anecdotes. An experience of visiting one of our programs in Ethiopia a year and a half ago, and it was a program working in organic coffee production, and we visited one of the primary cooperatives. And we just happened upon a whole group of young women who had migrated from another rural area to do seasonal work in drying in the coffee cooperative. And it became clear through talking to them for a few minutes that this was very seasonal, erratic work, that they had no contracts, that they had no guarantee of employment, and they were being paid well below the minimum wage. Equally, in my experience working with Oxfam in West Africa, where there's a very strong, it's very smallholder farming based economies, a very strong peasant movement with a strong belief in smallholder farming systems. And I worked a lot on the cotton sector there, but it's a sector which, is very much underpinned by a lot of unrecognised and unremunerated work of women's family labour. And many economists will even go as far as to argue that is the basis of its competitiveness, that it can draw on that family labour. So I'll conclude there and hope that that's given the other panellists and you some food for thought.
Great. Thank you very much, Sally. We'll just keep going through the panel and then we'll open it up for discussions. So meet Martens, who's from the University of Louvain.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to be a part of this panel here this afternoon to discuss on the issues of smallholder farming versus wage labor. But let me first start with saying something about all these transformations that are ongoing in agri-food systems in developing countries, And the driving forces of that, as Sally already mentioned, there's a lot of globalization ongoing, and that contributes to a big part, I think, to what is going on in changes in the food systems also in developing countries. So this globalization has to do with increased food exports from developing countries as well, the increased importance of fresh produce like fresh fruit and vegetables rather than coffee, tea and cacao, which were more the traditional tropical exports. We are moving more towards fresh food exports from developing countries, which is in itself an important change. We have the rise of supermarkets here in Western economies that are kind of dominating food supply chains, and that creates issues such as vertical coordination and so on that are trickling down the whole supply chain. Also in developing countries itself, more in the middle income countries, also supermarkets are increasingly playing an important role there. Their standards, we attach a lot of importance at quality, food safety standards, all kinds of ethical and environmental standards in our food systems. And so this is tremendously changing the way in which food is produced and traded, and with big consequences for developing countries. So it causes some kind of consolidation in these food supply chains, with the power in the chains in hands of just a few companies. And very importantly, it leads to increased vertical coordination, and an extreme form of that is vertical integration, where, for example, export companies take over the role of primary production and start their own production units in these countries. And that has or plays a big role in the shifts that we see from smallholder farming to large-scale integrated farming. But as Sally already mentioned, the shift is not complete, and it's not a dichotomy between smallholder farming and big-scale farming based on hired labor, because these systems coexist, okay? We still have many traditional supply chains that are completely based on smallholder farming for the domestic markets. We have high-value export chains that are based either on contracted farming with smallholders or on large-scale farming. So the systems coexist. There's also not a dichotomy between independent smallholders that make all the decisions on their farms independently versus workers that just supply their labor to these companies. There's also different forms of contracting going on, which is like in between independent farmers and wage labor, because farmers have to deal with companies, have to produce in a way that these companies require, and so on. And so they already lose independence through these contract farming systems. So the least we can say is that we in many countries have transformations ongoing, that these transformations are likely to continue in the future, likely to become important if export markets expand further, if supermarkets penetrate further in these markets. And it has created a kind of heterogeneous landscape of food systems in these countries. And in some countries this transformation is more pronounced than in other countries and sectors, clearly. But so the main issue there with all these transformations is that indeed we have some kind of a shift, although it's not a complete shift, from smallholder farming that is based on family labor, that's the definition of smallholder farming, and towards more large-scale farming based on hired labor that is becoming more important. But so both exist next to one another. And my main argument is that this large-scale farming, which is often seen as particularly bad from a development perspective, is not necessarily bad. We have observed cases where large-scale farming that is based on hired labor is particularly beneficial from a development perspective. It benefits the poor, so it's good for the poor, and it's good for women in particularly. And the main reason for that is because it creates employment opportunities in rural areas where employment opportunities, off-farm employment opportunities are scarce for rural households. And these employment opportunities are particularly accessible for the poor and for women. So we have this feminization, specifically in agro-export industries. We see a lot of women involved in employment in these companies. And also the poor have access to this employment, while, for example, women and the poor are often excluded from contract farming and for entering profitable export markets. And we observe that this is associated with positive development effects. So women and poor people engaging in employment in agro-industries benefit from that. And one of the reasons that this is specifically important for women is because women are often, in smallholder farming, women are often involved as unpaid family labor. They do not have the power to control the returns from their labor. They do not have the power to control the income generated from the smallholder farm, while if they work outside the family farm in a bigger company or in the agro industry or whatever employment is available, that they often have more and more direct control over the returns of their own labor, and that it increases the bargaining power over household income in general, and it leads to female empowerment economically because women become more economically independent, but also socially, the fact that women come outside their own family farm and their own household, meet other women, or organized maybe in labor groups and so on, also increases their social empowerment. Another issue I would like to mention is that it's not either or. There's a lot of interaction between smallholder farms and the agro industry through contract farming, but also through wage employment, because wage laborers, they typically only allocate part of their labor to working for a wage. Other part of their labor are allocated to their family farm or to other businesses. And we observe a lot of spillover effects between these activities. If women or if poor people in general can earn wages outside their own family farm, part of these wages are reinvested or can be reinvested in their farm, increasing the productivity on their family farm as well. So it's not either or. It's often that wage labor does not necessarily draw labor away from the family farm, decreasing productivity and so on, decreasing yields. It's often that wages earned in these industries or off-farm are reinvested in the family farm, creating positive investment spillover effects. And that might be true for family farm businesses, but also for off-farm, for non-farm businesses. So we see that women who can earn wages, that they have wages that they can invest, income that they can reinvest in creating off-farm businesses. And we also observe if women have access to wages and access to off-farm employment, that is associated with other positive development effects like investment in child schooling and so on. So that's also an important contribution of female empowerment through giving them access to off-farm wages. So it's not either or. It's not either large-scale farming based on hired labor or smallholder farming based on family labor. There are many interactions, investment interactions, and so on. And well, smallholder farming is actually the default livelihood in many rural areas in developing countries. It's often not something that people choose for. They are a smallholder family farmer by default because there are no other options. And I think development of rural employment sectors through exports, through supermarkets and so on, through the whole transformations that we are seeing, might be positive from a development perspective because at least it opens up choices. People have the choice of working on their own farm or working off-farm for a wage. There are different risks involved, there are different returns involved as well, but the choices they can make are important. And I think there is, among many policymakers, a kind of ideological view on smallholder farming. It's put forward as well, independent farmers. They can make their own decisions. They are independent, but in fact they take a lot of risk. And in fact, it's often not their choice. And I think also a development model where we keep on focusing only on smallholder farming is deemed to keep smallholder farmings being smallholder farms. If we want development, that means that some people will have to move out of farming and other smallholder farmers will have to climb up. And wage labor can be a very important factor in there. Wage labor can play a very important role. If wages, earned wages in an agro industry are invested, for example, in off-farm businesses, then in the long run we might observe some rural households being able to leave agriculture and really to set up off-farm rural businesses or non-farm, non-agriculture rural businesses facilitated with income they earned from wages. Others will likely continue for a long time working as laborers in small-scale or big-scale companies while others might be able to climb up and become more professional and more market-oriented in their small-scale farm businesses. And all that, a point to stress is indeed, and it has been stressed before by Sally and also by Stephanie in the introduction, that we need to pay a lot more attention in policy thinking on the importance of wage labor, because it can be an important facilitator for further development, and it has been ignored by many policies. Thank you. That's where I would like to stop.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would like to thank Steph and Bill for giving me the opportunity to be part of this panel, which is discussing a very important issue. Now, I would just like to draw your attention first to the magnitude of the problem when we're discussing smallholder versus wage labor in agriculture. We are talking about 85% of the holders being small in terms of owning or operating less than 2 hectares of land. Whether you talk of China or India or Bangladesh or Ethiopia or some Latin American countries. So we are basically talking about large mass of the population directly dependent on agriculture as farmers as well as labor which works on those farmers' lands, smallholders' lands. So we have to really keep in mind what kind of magnitude we are facing in terms of when we're talking people moving from being farmers to being wage labor. Also, I would like to differ slightly with Sally in terms of the dichotomy between these two sets of populations, that is smallholders and agricultural labor. There is some overlap, but they are not necessarily of the same type. There is a clear class of landless people who are only agricultural labor. They have nothing else to fall back on. They are just 2 hands they have to work on others' farms. There are some smallholders who do part-time labor work, but if you look at relatively agriculture developed regions, it's either farmers or agriculture workers, households. There are no overlaps of any significant kind. And they also differ significantly in terms of social and cultural background they come from. So you really can't look at these populations as similar or being same in terms of the profile they have, the kind of resource base or resource endowments they have. So we have to look at that significantly. We are not talking about the same population. We are talking 2 different sets of population when we're talking about labor versus smallholders. Now coming to the issue of why are shifts taking place, I'm not really very sure which way the shift is taking place. If I give you some figures and some evidence that there are even landless people who never had any land, they are leasing in lands to do farming for supermarkets in countries like India and China. So it's not that people are leaving agriculture and agriculture is totally non-viable or unviable. There are people who are coming into farming because they never had a chance to become a farmer. But now they are finding that if you grow certain crops, now it also depends what kind of farming you do. Farming can range from growing cereal crops to growing very high value exotic fruits and vegetables. So I think we have to keep that in mind, what kind of agriculture we are talking about. And if you look at the general picture, which is more about non-high value crops in terms of smallholders being involved in field crops, food and other related cereal crops, then we are looking at complete neglect of agriculture during the last 2 decades across the globe. Agriculture has not got the kind of policy and other treatment it should have got in terms of attention from different levels of governance. So that has led to the kind of stagnation we are facing today, which is leading us to think in terms of moving people out of agriculture somehow or the other, which perhaps is not the right approach, as I would like to argue here. One, that when you're talking about smallholders, most of them are excluded from the modern markets, which are the dominant paradigm to think of agriculture today. But most of the smallholders, as Ali has also pointed out, are not really there in terms of the areas where these buyers go and buy or ask them to grow under contract or other arrangements, the crops being chosen to grow, to buy these crops, the farmers being chosen to become contractor or other growers supplying farmers, and the technology being used, the way crops are grown. I think all that leads to a lot of exclusion of really small holders from the modern markets, which are the happening markets around the globe. Also, there are issues in terms of non-viability of smallholders if you do traditional type of farming. For example, if somebody just growing cereal crops, then that smallholder will not be able to do a good livelihood for his family or her family, because there are issues of high cost and poor quality inputs and lack of negotiation power in terms of dealing with the markets, in terms of buying or selling. That's why there is a tendency of reverse tendency in very many areas, where actually small and marginal farmers are getting out of farming leasing out their lands to large and medium farmers who have the resources to cultivate larger acreage and become large suppliers to large buyers. So we have that kind of situation also. In fact, in India, there is a recent survey which says that 40% of the farmers in general, including most of the smallholders, would like to move out of farming if they had any alternative. So that is the state of affairs in terms of lack of viable opportunities to eke out a livelihood out of farming. And that is further sort of reinforced by issues like when you don't have enough resources, working capital or investment resources available in terms of credit, which also has led to a lot of exclusion of smallholders in terms of they not getting the kind of credit facilities or investment support they used to get earlier. So all that is making what agriculture is there in front of us in terms of viable or non-viable occupation. Add to that, if we are talking about smallholders, necessarily require that people work collectively. But if you look at the extent of collectivization, it is so badly done that even in a country like India, which has a lot of history of cooperative movement and so on, which has not worked so well, only 5% of the farmers were members of self-help groups and just 2.5% member of any farmer organization of activity. So we are talking about completely individual farmer-based management of smallholder occupations, which is definitely not going to be able to compete with the other alternative which may be available in the market. Further, when it comes to selling the output of smallholders, they again face a lot of market mistreatment in terms of markets not dealing fairly with them. There is evidence that smallholders have higher yields than larger holders, but when it comes to selling their output, they get lower prices than their larger counterparts. So it's markets which are not giving a fair deal to smallholders, even if they are efficient producers. So production is not an issue. Issue is how does a smallholder or their collectivity deal with the market, which ultimately makes or mars the game in terms of being viable or not being viable. Moving on, we are talking so much about value addition. Now, how can this value addition be helpful if it is not converted into value sharing? Now, a lot of the contract farming arrangement, a lot of these modern supermarket chains and other value chains deal with market farmers, smallholders, wherever they occasionally, but then they do not really do anything which is of the type of value sharing, not just procuring from supplying farmers and making money, but also plowing back some of the benefits in terms of providing support, in terms of investments, or covering risk of the farmer, production risk or market risk, or upgrading them in terms of becoming, making them more viable suppliers over longer periods of time. So I think we are stuck with that kind of problem where the markets have not given a fair deal to smallholders, and therefore they are being treated as non-viable, unviable, and therefore we're talking about the option of moving them into agricultural labor. Looking at the gender issues, yes, women are left behind because men are moving out in most of the situations in farming areas, but women do not have land rights, land titles. Even in India, it's only 11% women who have land in their name, but they don't necessarily control that, but they do work on those farms more as paid or unpaid family labor. Similarly, there's a lot of feminization of agriculture workforce in terms of women workers being preferred by employers because they are lower cost, they are more docile, they do not revolt, they do not demand very many facilities and other rights. There's a lot of preference, in fact, for female child labor for many modern agribusiness occupations like hybrid seed production, where you have to do cross-pollination of flowers. So it's female labor which is employed and preferred. You pay less, you get more work, better work done. It's more efficient labor management and labor utilization. A lot of the technology being used in farming are gender insensitive. You don't have agriculture technologies which take care of the women's needs in terms of being workers who are different from the male workers. But if still we are talking about gainful employment, gainful livelihoods out of farm and allied activities, then I think there's no other way but to support and strengthen smallholder based agriculture, both as smallholders as well as agriculture workers working on those farms. Right now, because of the kind of technologies being used and the kind of crops being grown, the employment elasticity of agriculture output is low, but it certainly is not going to go up if you allow more large scale corporate farming, because those farms are likely to be, as evidence shows, more mechanized, more capital intensive, and therefore less labor intensive, and therefore we can't expect more gainful employment on the farm production front. There may be gains in terms of pack houses and processing and value addition, but not on the farm production front. you release. Also, I think one has to look at the larger issue. We are just not talking about more food production or more agriculture production and agriculture growth. It's also important from equity point of view on whose lands and whose farm this output is produced. If you take that argument, I think it's still important to retain people, give them the right to keep small little lands they have, so that they have that ownership, they have that real asset, which may be very valuable after some time, may not be today. So I think there is a need to look at that as well, instead of just talking about producing more or producing more efficiently without bothering about who is producing for what and why, and what does it mean in terms of socially optimal benefits of that. And I would like to remind you that it's not that small farms have never been useful. All the agriculture growth which took place in Korea, China, Japan, Taiwan, and some parts of India also, which we know as green evolution, it was all based on small farms. It was not corporate farms. And again, if you look at the entire debate about inverse farm size productivity relationship, it points to that it's not that smallholders are sort of inherently inefficient. They have been as good or sometimes better than larger counterparts of theirs. Also, there are many other benefits in terms of biodiversity, in terms of diversity in the cropping pattern, multi-crops, intercrops, being more labor intensive and making more efficient and sustainable use of natural resources if you look at smallholders compared to large-scale plantations or other field-based corporate farming. And the evidence, before we conclude on this, the evidence across the globe is that corporate farming has not worked anywhere in the world. You look anywhere, it's still the corporate contract farming kind of models, more the vertical coordination with the smallholders or medium holders, which has done whatever has been done to the farm production and processing sector so far. So let's not look at options which are not going to be viable anyway, neither in terms of efficiency nor in terms of the employment and livelihood benefits of these models. So we need to look at that. So I would rather argue more for linking farmers with markets through mechanisms like contract farming or producers organizations. In India, we have a new model called producer companies now, where 10 or more producers can come together and organize themselves to a private corporate entity and can do anything in terms of producing, processing, marketing, exporting, importing of agriculture produce. So you have those kind of institutional arrangements which can deliver the goods in an even market-based environment for smallholders. So we need to look at this. And this is happening. Even you look at China, China's contract farming system, very, very small holders are producing high-class products which are being bought by exporters and supermarkets and being sold in all the premium markets. On the labor side, yes, there are issues in terms of labor conditions not being so good. There are a lot of gender gap in wages. The minimum wages are not being paid in most of the situations. But then that's what the local conditions can afford. I'm not arguing for lower wages. I'm all for attending to the problems of labor per se, without linking them up with the farmers' problems or farmers' issues. We need to certainly do more in terms of improving labor conditions in agriculture situations. Even if you bring corporates there, it's not that labor will be treated better. You may get some initial benefits in terms of more employment being generated, but ultimately, because of the efficiency considerations, there'll be less of employment, there'll be exploitation of labor, as has been seen in many situations across the agricultural situations. So I think we need to think twice before we conclude on promoting large-scale corporate farming instead of smallholder-based agriculture and taking the labor route, wage labor route, to improving livelihoods of or reducing poverty of rural people. I would stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all three speakers. That's been very informative. A lot of food for thought, and many, many issues have been raised. Definitely some differences. Some people, some kind of reflection, certainly that a lot of diversity, not the same. Has wage labour always existed? Is this nothing new? Just a sort of large, landless, casual labour force plus smallholders? Or is it actually systems that are coexisting? Is there really change taking place? Are smallholders being excluded and there's a whole new army, if you like, of wage labourers being created? Is the way forward through commercial farming, or is it through maintaining smallholder farming, or is it actually much more complex than that? So I'll throw it open and get thinking, ideas. As I said before, I don't want to do it as a question and answer. So please just raise your points. Could you just briefly say who you are, raise your points, and then I would like to kind of get more thinking and other points from within the audience here, and hopefully from live stream. So Barbara Hivos is over here, and she will be helping to input anybody who's wanting to come in through the live stream to join the debate or make points or points that haven't been raised. Don't rush. Yes.
Hi, thanks. My name's Mike Bird. I work for Women in Informal Employment, Globalising and Organising. And just wanted to pick up on a point, point that Meet made, and then I think it was picked up by Sukhpal as well. You talked about the opportunities that can be brought by supplying into global chains and more commercial agriculture. But I'd say whether or not the benefits accrue to the rural poor depends on the terms on which they're employed. And you know, there's nothing transformative about going to work on a big farm. And I think that was what Sally was saying as well. It doesn't actually transform gender relations to have women going together from their home to work somewhere else. And our experience is that organising doesn't just happen. You need to work with those women to raise their awareness of the situation that they're in, and to work with them on how better to organise. And that's when some of those benefits start to accrue, not just by opening up those kinds of opportunities.
Pyatt, 2050 Ventures. Do you feel that the interests of the poor in the different ways that you've described them are at odds with the interests of the bigger globalised markets they're connecting with or aligned with, or does it differ?
I'd like to throw that open to everybody and then maybe come back to the panel in a minute. So are new global markets creating new opportunities for the poor, or are they actually making life harder is really the question. Yes.
John van Dersen, Hivos. I'd just like to respond to your kind of open question. Well, I've seen Dole and Chiquita operate, certified, fair trade, organic. And if you look at the situation of the farmers and their families, you just look at slavery. Because the prices and the long-term contracts that they negotiate is just enough for survival, but that's it. So the whole idea of people being able to reinvest money into their own farms and all that is actually communicated in the marketing towards the consumer, but the reality on the ground is very different. And this is large scale.
So could I take that example and dig into that? Because I wonder whether that situation actually is in the interests of the larger company that's putting those contracts in place. Is it always in their interests? It might be exploitative, might actually not be in their interests. And do we have any insight into that?
More other people, please join this discussion. It's Bill, sorry, towards this end.
Carlos Oya from SOAS, University of London. I have one concrete question. I wanted to know more about, from your research, the key factors driving this move towards estate farming away from contract farming. Why is it in the interest of capital to make this move? Is it related to access to land and how land access is negotiated differently now from previous times? And then a couple of comments. One is a lot of the statements that come from these debates, large versus small, is agricultural wage labor neglected or not, are far too general statements. They do not take into account huge differences across contexts. And let me just point out 5 factors which would explain why some of these dichotomies are useless in some of these contexts. One, land labor ratios are very different, across Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East and North Africa, and Asia indeed. capital labor ratios, regardless of land labor ratios, are also quite different across this context, and that also explains why certain forms of production prevail in some contexts rather than others. The politics of land and the politics of market access is extremely varied and heterogeneous across contexts. That has to do with the history of these different spaces. Fourth, the degree of industrialization. You know, we always talk about agriculture in isolation from other sectors. Cannot understand some of these movements, some of these dynamics, whether smallholder agriculture is the default option or not, in the absence of an understanding of what's happening to other sectors, whether a country is industrializing or not. And that also refers to the viability of small-scale farming in contexts like mentioned before, like East Asia. Okay, and five, there's also huge heterogeneity in terms of the availability and the quality of the evidence that can be used to engage with these debates. Talking about agricultural wage labor in Latin America and Asia is one thing. Talking about agricultural wage labor in Sub-Saharan Africa is a completely different thing. Simply because these data are not collected, or are not collected systematically enough to make any assertion, to make any, to come up with any conclusion about this large versus small, wage labor versus smallholder. And the final comment is, partly because of this lack of evidence, a very big neglect in most of these debates is understanding the conditions of employment among smallholders. Smallholder farmers do employ labor. So when we talk about how bad are labor conditions in Chiquita, these big plantations, or in Senegal, etc., how much comparative analysis is there? Comparative in the sense of actually comparing like with like, crops and historical context, geographical context, between the employment conditions in smallholder farms compared to employment conditions in large-scale farms. Okay, and there are many different reasons why these conditions might differ massively.
Great, you've raised a number of key issues there. Eleni will help with the microphone passing over. I think there are a number of issues there that really need to be brought into the discussion around land, migration, industrialization, the sort of industrial context, this lack of data availability, which is such a critical issue. And are things really, I mean, they might be bad, but are they worse given the options? So I'd like to bring, other people might want to just pick up on one or other of those issues. I don't know if any of the panel want to come back on any of those issues. There was a specific question about more information from the research, so I don't know, do you want to just respond to that, and then we can open it up? Can you indicate if you want to speak as well? Sorry, did you want to just respond to
on the question on the quality and the availability of data? Yeah. First of all, I think you're right. I think our discussions were very much focused on specific continents. My experience is in Africa, and we have collected data and analyzed certain issues in detail. So we do have quality evidence on the benefits for women, for poor households of engaging in wage labor. But you're right. I think the points you mentioned there are lots of differences across the continents. And there's definitely also a difference in the availability of evidence material and quality of that evidence, for sure. For Africa, I would say there's a lot of recent evidence on this issue, on smallholder contract farming, wage labor, not so much yet on the gender issues, but let's hope that's an emerging literature as well.
Sally, did you want to come in now, or do you want to?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up the point, or keep going anyway, the point that was raised about, the relative interests of corporates and small farmers in engaging in these globalized chains. Not because I have a definitive answer, but I think my answer is it kind of depends. Certainly my experience of working in a largely smallholder farming-based region in Francophone West Africa, where you had what were previously kind of parastatal, essentially companies, agro companies, but then processes of privatization, but some of which have enabled kind of continued long-term investment in smallholder-based systems, and so there's a kind of, there is a mutual interest. I mean, the company has to have the smallholder suppliers, and so they have to kind of, so it's about what are the relative negotiating powers and so on. And the question is, when you get processes of change like privatization of those companies, what happens to the balance of forces there? And if you have liberalization and a sort of fracturing of those companies, do you weaken the bargaining power vis-a-vis the international traders? If the farmers are organised at national level, what is their bargaining power vis-a-vis the companies? And so I think there are lots of issues of sort of how those forces balance out. I guess, depending on also the nature of the company and its kind of global strategy and how important that long-term relationship is with a particular region or set of producers is going to affect whether or not they really care about the sustainability of the labour force or their livelihoods, I suppose is my thinking on that. But I'd really like to hear more what other people think on that question.
Great.
Paul Spray from Tradecraft. I'm remembering a conversation about 10 years ago on a flower farm in Kenya, which was a big flower farm employing wage labour, with a specialist in integrated pest management. And he was explaining the complicated way in which this integrated pest management was possible to deliver on these flower farms, and that it was essential if the flowers were going to get into the European market. And he said, this technology is seriously difficult to operate. You need high levels of skills, and I can't see how it could be made available to smallholders. Now, it so happened that this guy was a Cuban. And he said, of course, in Cuba we could do it because we still have an agricultural extension system that gets out to smaller farmers. I have no idea if it's true or not, but this is the principle he was saying. From which I would take a number of points. First, the point about the specificity. I mean, a flower farming demanding the kind of integrated pest management that the European Union insists on is clearly a very specific kind of crop and going into a very specific supply chain, and it looks as though smallholders there have little opportunity. But the second point is that the availability of institutional support, whether it's private sector or public sector, for smallholders makes a serious difference to their ability to keep going.
Thank you. The issue here we are talking about...
Just say your name.
My name is Wilfred Kamami. I come from Kenya, and I work with smallholder system. The issue here is about the whole setup is the market. If the market addresses the products we sell, the returns will be high, and the welfare of whoever is doing it, being either wages or smallholder contracted, they will be better. Coming back to what have been said of the smallholder and pest management and weighed by the two sectors, the global is safer with smallholder than in the big order, the large scale, because large scale are the ones seen to use a lot of chemicals, doing away with the predators and leaving the global in danger. Smallholder can afford and can understand and can address and can see every day their farms as they walk. And we have seen that because we have been certified in Kenya, smallholder with rainforest, and they are very particular on the environment. For the 15 years we have been sending flowers to Europe. Our flowers have never been detected worse off than the bigger scale farmers, or in comparison that we are endangering the produce from Kenya because we have been sending smallholder flowers. On the contrary, same big large-scale farms, when they have been, the issue of global gap came in, there was a threat and a lot of saying that the smallholder veg will be kicked out. On the contrary, the same companies, they had to bring smallholder gap because they could not do it because 70% of the beans, 7% of the veg comes from the smallholder. And there is global gap for the small and there is global gap for the large. So here, we have to be particular. These people cannot afford these high chemicals. They work, some of the things they work with herbs, biological, natural, and in the end, you are much safer with smallholder. A commercial farm cannot come up together with a big address of natural products because they fear. So at times we look down the smallholder, but I would say the market, let us look to the market. What is the market already? We are lacking market. And we are here to address market to smallholder, to large scale. And if we answer the market to elevate poverty, that one is the key issue here. Because the market has to address to those people. The other thing I have heard, which I feel there have been, I haven't seen, I live in a very near large plantation. I haven't seen a wage laborer taking money home for him to get labor. On the contrary, they get food from home to go and sustain themselves in their labor. On the contrary, the issue that people will be employed in the plantations so that they can take money to employ labor at home, I still yet to see that. And but I have seen a lot of food done in Kenya. Horticulture and the vegetables feeding the country is done by the smallholder. And the horticulture is feeding the country in a very big way. But people always look at grain, maize, what, but there's vegetables, there is carrots, there is all that. So we have to address, the market is big in the sense of even local. We always look at the export rather than addressing also the local market, which is the biggest, if we well dated. We are lacking data here. I agree with the person who is saying we are lacking data. The data has to be the issue to get exactly what we are talking about. Because without data, will be kicking left and forth, and then we get lost.
Can I just, while the microphone, can I just sort of throw in one issue that's kind of lurking here that I think could come out more, particularly in many countries, including in Africa. As development takes place, you're getting an increasing process of urbanization. And let's forget the international for a minute. Just simply movement, particularly of younger people, from the rural to the urban. Now that's, as I've seen it in the places I've been, leading to two challenges. A, it means there are less younger people available to produce food on smallholder farms. But secondly, the increasing challenge of a smallholder farming sector trying to feed a larger urban population. So there does seem to me to be a structural problem here, issue here, and is that a pressure that is potentially driving some form of commercialization? And if so, what form? I'm just throwing that in really as a question. The microphone's now gone on. Yes, great. So you could introduce yourself as well.
Hi, John Bird from the Red Cross. We've talked quite a lot about the sort of gender externalities and comparative gender externalities of the two different modes of production. What do you guys think about the environmental externalities? Because obviously with kind of exports, if you're hitting export markets, you're talking about increased emissions, but there's also potential for sort of positive impacts if there are better standards around, I don't know, organic farming. So what do people think of those comparative externalities?
Okay. I don't know if somebody wants to. Yes, we've got Barbara.
Just two comments.
This is from the live stream.
Two comments in response to your presentation, speaking from Kenya. You're right.
Wait, just wait a second.
Comments from the live stream in relation to the speaker from Kenya, that they're saying you're right, smallholder systems are more diverse and less sensitive to the results of pests and disease. Agrochemical use is much smaller, and integrated pest management is not a particular challenge in flowers. It's more difficult to reach for smallholders because of documentation, registration requirements, and costs of compliance.
Can we pass over there?
And Sofia Gagno from, I'm a PhD student here at IDPM. And just a brief comment to say that I think two of something that two previous commentators made an allusion to, and I'd like to bring greater emphasis to, is the role of the state. It seemed like both in extension services and in just the global role of the market, it seems like the forgotten or element is the state and the role that it could play in creating the infrastructure that would sustain the jobs that could indeed lead to greater participation of the poor, for instance.
Okay, I would just like to respond to this question about environmental aspects of modern value chains or agribusiness players. I think it depends on the market which is being catered to by the agribusiness player. So there's nothing about whether they lead to degradation or never lead to, but it depends on which market they're catering to. Now there are companies which are proactively promoting organic farming, proactively cutting the use of chemical inputs because markets do not accept that. So in fact, I'll just give you one example from a Canadian multinational which is operating in India, which is doing contract farming of potatoes. Now there's no requirement for this company to mandate to the farmers that you would adopt micro-irrigation. But they're saying anybody who does not adopt micro-irrigation systems would not be taken as a contractor for the company because they're operating in a water-scarce area. So I think there are companies which also understand the market requirements. So it's the markets, buying markets, which make companies behave and deliver benefits of environmental type to the ground. So a lot of organic movement is driven by the private companies because markets require that. So there's nothing like that agribusiness always does damage to environment. It depends on which markets are being catered to. That would determine whether it's...
Can I continue on that?
Yes.
There's some additional things I would like to mention on the environmental externalities, because you also mentioned, it's maybe a little bit away from the discussion on smallholders versus workers, but you mentioned the transport system and everything. So is exports of fresh fruit and vegetables, for example, from Africa or other developing regions, is that sustainable from an environmental point of view? So, and one thing there is clearly the transport, but we really have to realize that in terms of emissions and so on, it really depends a lot on how things are transported and not so much the distance they transport. If beans, for example, let's say beans from Senegal are transported by ship in big containers, I mean, that's the kilogram of beans that then arrives in Europe, delivered at a port nearby. I mean, in terms of environmental consequences or emissions, that's so much less than, for example, transporting things over land in small trucks from Spain, for example, to France or to Belgium. So we really have to think very carefully about that, because it's very easy to say these things are bad from an environmental point of view because they come from too far away. It really matters how things are transported and also how they are produced. I mean, if they are produced under sunshine, without greenhouses and so on, it's often from an energy point of view better. And also in the discussions maybe of large scale versus small scale, also there, I think a lot more data and evidence is needed, because we don't know what is more environmentally beneficial, small-scale farming or large-scale farming. And it also depends on the issues at stake. Water, for example, is often used much more efficiently through drip-to-drip and very advanced irrigation systems in large-scale farming than on smallholder plots, while indeed pesticide issues, it might be the other way around. So I think we need much more evidence of these kind of things.
Hi, it's Kath.
Sorry, this is for the translators.
Oh, sorry. Catherine Hill from Adam Smith International. Just a small point, really, in regards to the gender dimensions, and a common assumption that I feel like is being made, that increasing women's incomes will necessarily lead to empowerment. I'm thinking about some recent work I did in the Philippines, where, for various reasons, women's incomes were increasing, but it wasn't necessarily leading to empowerment, particularly in terms of power relations within the home, because for various reasons, women were having to actually hide how much they were earning, because it was leading, them kind of declaring that was leading to increased risk of domestic violence, alcoholism, and various other social problems. I guess it just kind of, this links into these wider debates about things having to be very kind of tailored to the local context in terms of the social relations, and also in terms of kind of this difference between formalised labour and informal labour, and the fact that increasing women's participation in formal labour won't necessarily always be positive and beneficial.
Right, thank you. Yes, just behind us.
Hi, Mike Bird again. Just looking at the title, Making Markets Work for Smallholders or Waged Labour, and just wanted to raise the point of the role that buyers can play in the whole supply chain. We saw this in Southeast Asia, where you've got local buyers who monopolize on different crops, and so their role is massive. But how you regulate things so that can be changed is quite difficult, especially when even borders can be got around. There's a lot of smuggling across borders. So just reflecting on how difficult it is to put in place mechanisms that will get over those kind of local power interests.
We're just one very quick comment, and then we need to wrap up this panel, and then we're going to have a short break, and then we're going to move on to the next panel. So, Eleni, the final comment for this panel, and then I'll come back if there are any final reflections.
Hi, Sarah Galligan, a postgraduate from IDPM, and I conducted a study into the incorporation of Lake Victoria's now perch fishermen into the processing supply chain. I call them fictitious self-employed, to borrow a phrase. And this actually, I guess, backs up Paul Spray's points about the importance of institutions as well as environmental standards, which Sally commented on. And I think that one thing I looked at was that the environmental standards were far more important in pushing the self-employed farmers into tying themselves with big processors. But also what was characteristic of these fishermen I looked at was the lack of institutional support and the ineffectiveness of cooperatives. And therefore I would say to make markets work in that situation, that would be an example of how smallholders would have to do it there.
Thanks. Okay, we've got one more on live stream.
There's just one discussion which is saying there seems to be a consensus that small holdings are better. Sorry, I keep forgetting this. On the live stream, there seems to be
a suggestion that there is a consensus that the smallholding or the smallholder farmers are better for the environment, better for employment, and are more sustainable. And there's also a discussion about the issue of transport and the environment, and this transition shifts towards sea transport away from air transport. And there's now a discussion starting about agrochemical use in different countries, but particularly here there seems to be focusing on the carbon footprint of transport.
Thank you. I'm just going to come back to any last reflections from this panel, then we'll have a short break and then we'll move to the next panel. Sally.
Thanks, Stephanie. So lots of very interesting and somewhat contradictory and complementary points were raised. I just wanted to come back to two issues. So one in relation to one of the last speakers who talked about the lack of correlation between earning an income and women's empowerment. And I mean, I'd like to strongly endorse that point, whether it's in terms of wage labour or women being able to earn income directly in the market. Those can contribute, they can be catalysts to processes of change within the household, within wider communities, but they can't in and of themselves create women's empowerment. And so in that sense, I also sort of am supporting the point made by Mike Bird that there are sort of other types of change that are needed, but those changes can begin to shift perceptions and attitudes and beliefs and be the basis on which other processes of change can be built. Just also to emphasize that, you know, getting women into the market does not solve the problem, because markets themselves are gendered. And I'd like to come back to the point about the cut flower industry or the horticulture industry and the fact that you have a feminized labor force. I mean, of course there are direct benefits of having that employment and those wages to the individual women. But if you look at it in a larger pattern, what you find is that replicates certain kinds of advantage and disadvantage, and also that those positions aren't necessarily sustainable over time. And so it's not a kind of long-term net gain that's sustainable necessarily. We have to see that it's more nuanced and double-edged than that, because the conditions of that employment and its sustainability may not be very equitable. Then the last point I wanted to make, sort of building on that, is coming back to the very valid point raised by Sukpal about the inequity of investment. And that also links back to the role of the state and ag extension services, which, you know, sort of quasi don't exist in a lot of places, particularly in Africa. But the fact that to the extent that there has been that sort of starvation of investment in the agricultural sector, and a starvation of investment to smallholder farming in particular, you know, the category of people that has least benefited from that investment are women farmers, and partly because they haven't been sufficiently visible. The sector, as we've seen, is now becoming more feminized, and so the urgency of paying attention to the need to invest in women farmers and also to address the specific issues faced by women as agricultural workers, I think, has never been greater.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. A lot of very interesting points were raised, and I'm just gonna come back to some of them, mainly focusing on the gender dimensions again and on the smallholders versus wage labor issues. There was a question raised, and Sally just came back to it as well, on the labor conditions. What do we know about the labor conditions in large-scale farming with a lot of employment versus the labor conditions on smallholder farms that do hire some of their labor? We did look at this issue in Senegal, for example, and we were very surprised to find out that wages for women were larger on the large-scale farms as compared to wages in smallholder farms. And for the men, it was exactly the opposite. So we find that actually on the large-scale farms, the gender discriminations in wages was very much reduced. It was not eliminated, but it was at least very much reduced. So that was a positive finding there. But I agree, this is just one case study, and we need more studies of this kind, I guess. another important issue, and that was one of the first points that was raised, like all these opportunities that are created now, the globalization of supply chains, the supermarkets and so on, before it can really benefit, it will not benefit women if they're just employed and so on. They need to be organized and so on, and before these benefits can emerge. And I tend to agree, but and that's why also we need really to include a focus on labor markets and on wage labor in policy thinking, because it is indeed maybe not because women are earning wages that it automatically leads to very beneficial development effects, but it has the potential to do so. And so it's up to the development aid community to make sure that that potential is realized, and that these opportunities that are emerging because of private investment, that really emerging because of private sector investment, that the potential of that is realized. And I think there is a lot of unexplored potential for development aid and NGO actions there.
Thank you. And then just finally,
just one point. I think a very interesting point was made about institutional mechanisms. I think we need to do more institutional innovation and trial and error in terms of helping small producers link up with markets. And we don't need to be sort of negative about certain mechanisms like contract farming, because the systems are per se not bad. It depends on who practices contract farming, with whom, what terms and conditions, and for what purposes. So I think we need to be with open mind on some of these market-based sort of systems, and do a lot of institutional innovation in terms of farmer collectivization, whether it's aggregation of produce or bargaining better with the market-based agents or whatever. I think that is the way to go to help small producers meet the markets better. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to end this panel here. You're going to have a short breather break. This is just a comfort break. We will be coming back in 10 minutes. So we will be coming back in, so this is really just to stretch your legs, nothing else. And then we can finish on time. So I would just like to thank this panel and for all those who contributed, and from the live stream. And we'll come back in 10 minutes' time.